Thank you very much for that warm introduction and for inviting me to Caroline and to Professor Deegan. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here. I visited the library as a graduate student a few times, and very low budget, and it was a sort of the acme of my academic experience to have supper last night with, you know, in that hallowed space there.
Very happy
never
to
thought
provide
I'd make
that
it,
experience.
you know, never thought I'd make it. So I've made it coming to have supper at the British Library, with the King's Library looking over us. Now, when I was invited initially, I was on another panel, and I started thinking about publishing and Timbuktu. And the first thoughts I had were about the sort of rather sort of absence of, just timing myself, the absence of Timbuktu, sort of relative absence in academic, serious academic, scholarly publishing. It is dominated, I mean, Timbuktu is dominated, the publishing about Timbuktu is dominated by popular publishing. If you look at the British Library catalogue, for instance, which I did a number of years ago, and you can do it while sitting here, you'll come across about 200-300, maybe at most 300 titles, hardly any of them dealing with the kind of serious scholarly character of Timbuktu or of scholarly nature. I must say, it's not because of an absence of this, but because Timbuktu has this place in the popular imagination. I'll give you a few images just to remind you of this. So in the British Library catalogue, when I looked at it a couple of years ago, I found a Californian publisher, a Los Angeles publisher called Timbuktu Books, and it publishes mainly poetry, including such titles as SIT on My Shoes. You know, the Oxford Library still defines Timbuktu as used as the type of the most distant place imaginable. This is 2005. And of course, the Tennyson poem called Timbuktu, this kind of travelogue on Timbuktu. You know, I realized when I was reading to my son, I was studying Ottoman Turkish in Istanbul, and then I'll end up in Timbuktu. I don't know if there's a connection, but you know, you find Paul Auster's book. I don't know if any of you know this book, but it's about a dog called Timbuktu, and the dog, a sort of anthropomorphic thing. And when the dog, the author, the main character tells the dog, when you die, where do you go? You go to Timbuktu. You go nowhere, in other words, you know, you disappear. And the Cain Prize one day had that. And even in struggle, South African struggle literature, you get it coming up. And this is, there's no Tintin in Timbuktu, but this was produced in Senegal. They obviously know the attraction of people passing. I mean, you know, this is a place, since I have Bengali friends here, this is from a mall in Kolkata. It's a play parlor, a games parlor called Timbuktu. This is a rock group in Norway, Timbuktu, selling fancy household goods in Johannesburg. And then, of course, the VW called Tuareg. I can go on. I have fun collecting these things. Tuareg green tea pastels from Italy. And guys, if you want to really impress, go to Paris and buy this beautiful perfume. Jean-Germain Dupré called Timbuktu. It's a fantastic Timbuktu. I don't think the maker of that Timbuktu has ever been to Timbuktu, but it has its attractions. And this is the kind of popular publishing. You find it at the airport bookshelves and so on. So there's a lot of popular publishing, and it gets a lot of things wrong, of course. And so there's this big gap between scholarly publishing, popular publishing, and the really serious scholarly work tucked away in specialist journals, highly specialist journals, and undertaken by the specialist scholars. And so that I've looked at about 20, 30 textbooks, for instance, and there's this massive lag between what appears and what I know from the scholarly literature. You know, obscure journals, my colleagues won't like me to say this obscure, but a journal such as Sudanic Africa, you know, few sort of 50 readers or so, really specialist stuff, fantastic stuff. We look forward to it. It's ceased publication and it's become Islamic Africa. And what goes into textbooks, for instance. I recently, the person in charge of teaching teachers to teach history at the University of Cape Town School of Education asked me to come and talk to her about class about Timbuktu. I asked for the contemporary textbooks on African history that they use, and these were written by eminent colleagues of mine. And I mean, it's now we go to the other extreme of just this great romantic place that it was, and they were using gold coins, and people were, you know, just on the other extreme to the Hugh Trevor Roper. There was nothing in Africa. There is a whole lot of scholarly work on it, but it's very specialist. Consequently, I'm writing something now which hopefully will be somewhere between the academic and the popular. And it will come out in a series of 4 different books, and I'll mention the publisher in a moment and make a plug for it. And it will, we're doing a couple of things together, some of my students and I. And it's long overdue, obviously, and I'm hoping to come out with it. Now, this brings me to the point about Timbuktu itself, and the fact that although publishing is the wrong word to use, or not the right word to use, the fact is that there is a local scholarly, quote-unquote, publishing tradition in Timbuktu itself. And if you're a serious scholar, you have to engage with that tradition. You cannot do scholarly work about that part of Africa and not engage with the scholarship in Timbuktu itself. And this is why recently we had a fantastic conference in Birmingham. I don't know if Insa is here. She had a hand in it, and her supervisor is one of those figures, Paulo Moraes de Farias, who really came to revolutionize our understanding of that region's history, because he said the chronicles of Timbuktu, we should take them seriously, not only as sources, but as our colleagues. They had arguments to make. They were asserting positions. They were writing from within a context, and don't just use them to mine them for data, but use them as our colleagues that we need to be engaged with. And that tradition of scholarship, which is a long history, which is a long and deep history, continues in many ways. And it's in the manuscript form. It's in the manuscript form. These are handwritten works. And I recently published in Caroline's volume on the book in Africa, about one such figure who still writes longhand and has never had anything printed. He begged me once for a laptop. And, you know, if I was going to get him, it was easy within our reach to get him a laptop. The tradition of handwriting manuscripts would finish. So what sort of got out of this fix by not giving him a laptop and making all sorts of excuses. But he sends us scanned images of his manuscripts. So he continues to write manuscripts, which then become digital copies. And one of the things that is on the list of to-do things is to publish his works as scholarly works in good formatted script. Now, I just want to give you an example. So, yeah. So what I said, we have a scholarly tradition, and a scholarly tradition is premised on the fact that there is a literature. And so you come to Timbuktu and you'll encounter families bringing you things like this. Do you call it a library? Do you call it an archive? I've settled for collections. The Arabic word is khizana, a storage. They simply call it a storage. maktaba, or library is a recent term they use, and you absolutely you're confused by what to do with it. You kind of go back to your hotel and sort of want to run away, because where do you start with this kind of thing? As historians, we're used to working with catalogs, and we can check out what's happening. And we at the phase where we have to produce the catalogs, we have to get in there and make decisions about what is a manuscript and what is a document, and sort of really fundamental decisions we have to make. And I often think of myself as, you know, where other Europeanists were in the late 19th century or early 20th century or earlier, making these discoveries. But these texts are part of a living tradition of scholarship. There are still scholars moving around and using these things and making arguments about the past of the region based on these collections. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Let me just see. So it is also not peculiar to Timbuktu. I've come to talk of this place as a sign, really, for a series of connected places. One cannot talk of this without talking about 5 or 6 other places. Wallata, Jenny, Wadan, and Shinqit. And in fact, at some point, Timbuktu sort of drops out, and there are other cities and other towns, particularly in what is today Mauritania, that just outpaces it in terms of the production of manuscripts, of books, and production of scholars. There's a recent, fresh, off-the-press, 2-volume catalogue by Charles Stewart of 10,000 items of a 350-year period, a fantastic catalogue from Brill, and it just, you know, at the point where Timbuktu is declining, he's looking at places in what is today Mauritania and rising. And what my thinking about Timbuktu as a set of connected spaces where Timbuktu is just a sign for that region has led me to think about and to talk about much more is to think of the library as not a fixed space, but something that's mobile. It's really what we're talking about are mobile libraries. And I got this, I think as an insight, when I was looking and following the movement of these collections from Timbuktu to the capital Bamako during the crisis. I showed you those images of the archivists. They were just the enclosures. About 4,000 items disappeared. A couple were burnt as collateral damage, but you can see the enclosures. And that movement of books to Bamako, which I think was a mistake, but I wasn't there, I must add, led me to think of this mobility of these collections, and that when the South African government built that new library, maybe we just got it completely wrong. To build a state of the art, a state of the archive was just state of art archive was just maybe what was not needed, but we should have thought of much more decentralized way of dealing with these collections. Learning was interesting. Learning took place in very decentralized fashions. One of the things you read about in the textbooks is the University of Timbuktu. Well, there was no university called University of Sankore, the name of the mosque. You sat at the feet of scholars and you read a book and you memorized a book, or you got to a stage where you could comment on a book and copy a book, and that's how your curriculum would work out. And then you moved on. So given the long tradition of nomadism. Moving about meant moving about with your library, or meant moving about with parts of library and even parts of books. The fact is, none of these books are bound. They're all loose leaf, and they have enclosures. And there's never been a tradition of binding. And we know that the Quran, for instance, was used, the loose leaves distributed, and you could read easily in one setting the whole text, because everybody sitting in a session could have parts of the text. But so too other books could be distributed, could be disaggregated and brought together again. So it's led me to think about a series of questions about libraries, about our obsession with a fixed, beautiful building, and I do like your British Library fixed building, but it's also the nature of the book itself as a fixed, singular thing that is bound, and here it is not. Let me get on to talk about the other issue which we introduced and have introduced, and I don't know what it solves and what new problems it creates, and that is digitization. Now, let me just give you some more images here. Since the mid to late 90s, when the foundations came onto the scene, Ford and so on, the Mellon, and poured money into Timbuktu to produce, to digitize these collections, we've had so many questions come up around digitization. So what happened with the movement of the libraries? A lot of the digitized items just disappeared. So digitization will help us conserve some of these material or images of them for some time. If we look after the digitized images and we have the machinery that can always use these things. But there are crucial bits of evidence that digitization don't seem to be able to capture. I don't know if we have any paper historians with us here, but sometimes it's absolutely crucial evidence. So few of these things are dated. That's a big conundrum for us. When was this written? We can check because we know of the author, but sometimes the author's name has disappeared or the copy is. A recent PhD student of mine came across crucial evidence when she had a paper historian look at the piece of a manuscript and said, this is definitely factory age. 1840s, post-1840s. It can't be what the owner of the manuscript claims, 15th century. The evidence was in seeing the copy. And so I want to say digitization should be an entry, a pathway, a first encounter, but we should always have the record and the possibility of going to the thing itself. These manuscripts are things. They are material items. And there's lots of evidence and things going on there, which I don't think we should forget. And I think bringing materiality to them adds to the complexity and the richness of this, because these manuscripts were produced by scholars, but often these scholars were merchants, or they dealt with merchants who were trading in tea and sugar and leather goods and paper. No paper was produced in Timbuktu. The paper all comes from Southern Europe, Italian. We can still pick up some of the watermarks in that. So yes, there are. I'm for digitization to a point. I'm doing a lot of my own work with digitized images. I can't afford to go and spend a semester in Timbuktu or in Mali. and I do work with scholars there who then send me digitized images. I mean, I can, you know, it'd be unthinkable and impossible without that facility where I can call up or send an email and ask to get a digitized image. However, there are other problems, ethical and political questions. There are some of these. We have about 24 family collections in and around Timbuktu. And once your NGOs come in there, once your foundations come in there, people start seeing dollar signs. And what was family heirlooms become the possibility of earning and making money. And we've seen massive inflation of the number of items in Timbuktu libraries because they've learned, some conservators started pricing and making budgets based on the number of manuscripts. So what is a manuscript and what is a document, say a contract or an invoice, or that became a manuscript itself. And so the Al Furqan Foundation here in London, which has published lots of the catalogues, exclaimed at one of these meetings of the foundations, but Timbuktu then has more manuscripts than the whole of Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo put together, which of course is just nonsense. But there is this inflation because there's funding going to come in, and they're going to digitize and conserve, and there's a price for each one. We have, in our project in Cape Town, made a deal with one of these private libraries very early on, where we're going to mobilize funding, in this case through the Mellon Foundation, and we're going to have access to X number. It was 60 items, and the items will go onto our website, because it was absolutely necessary to impress upon this person, owner of this library, that unless people can work with this material, unless people have access to the material, the mythology is going to remain. We're going to have all sorts of claims in all directions. And they prepared metadata per manuscript, and we checked that metadata again. And so if you go to our project website, the Tombouctou, the French spelling, the Tombouctou Manuscripts Project, as a bona fide researcher, you can apply to have access to those manuscripts. So we put, every 4 or 5 months, we put a couple on after rigorous checking of their metadata and us entering new data. We haven't had many takers to come to this material, but at least we know for research purposes, they are accessible. It's unbelievable what kind of people come to you for manuscripts. I've had people wallpaper manufacturers coming to me to ask me for copies of a manuscript. Just one page, then we can make beautiful wallpaper. I've had people making bags and all unbelievable. Firstly, this is not our stuff. We don't know whether sacred discourse or not on these materials. So we have to be very careful that some commercial interests don't want to come in and make use of us. Now, just to conclude, so these are all just various kinds of scripts. So it's not Arabic of the Mashriq, of the East. It's very local Arabic. It's about 6 or 8 different local scripts, and they call it the same. That's the West. So we've been working with other regions on the continent with script. Okay, there's the bad conservation. Some do-gooders went in there, thought they had Japanese paper, and just messed up a manuscript. These are some of the catalogues. Okay. So that's the book that Maja was complimenting us on. What we did with this is published by the HSRC Press, and we're going to publish these books that we're busy with now. Some of them are completed. I'll tell you a bit about them. What we did with the HSRC Press book, the one in the middle, is it's very scholarly. But we worked with their designers, and if you look at the book, there's a lot of extracts in the columns, and because we probably were amongst the first give voice to the local collection owners. And so they represented in this book. They represented probably for the first time, they talking. And in fact, it was presented us with great difficulty because they speak Arabic of such a high classical kind. We had problems with it, you know. They've kept a kind of high classical Arabic, which is very seldom still used. But we translated these chapters. So their voices are there for the first time, number one. And they then allowed us to capture images of them. And so for very rarely too, we were able to reproduce images of the manuscripts in this book. So I like it because we did a number of things with this. And then finally, of course, the whole thing is freely downloadable. So you can download the entire book. But despite that, in Africa alone, we sold 1,200 copies. I don't know, Mary, if that's a bestseller or not. So we sold 1,200 copies. Excuse me?
I'm afraid it is.
It is, okay. So we sold 1,200 copies of this, and it went into French translation. And we have an Arabic translation, but it was done in Damascus, so the guy disappeared. I think Isaria, he knows the publisher. So we have the Arabic text, and then a Japanese scholar, actually a European medievalist, somehow fell on this, and I don't know what the state of that is. But so we, going from the archival, traditional publication, and it's available online. So we were trying to do quite a few things with this book, and I do still think that there is a need for that high-end, serious scholarship where you have command of the languages and the materials, but then also to make it accessible because there's this massive disjuncture in this knowledge. It's no longer the Utrecht-Europa, there's no history in Africa. It's now, you know, they were using gold coins in Timbuktu, and they had a university and all this kind of thing. So I think I'll leave it at that and entertain some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sari. Do you want to join us for some questions? Thank you very much. Do you want to join us for questions, or you can stay there? I mean, but maybe it's easier if seated, more comfortable. The description of very rich relationship between people and scholars and the new scholarship, and there seems to be all sorts of interactions that open new opportunities. And I think there is something in this, even in this correlation between popular and scholarly, and opportunities that might offer, that I think really opens lots of questions. Interlink between physical and digital, gosh, that's something that is all sure on all our minds. And I think very, very important comment that you made about mobility. And while being blessed with the lovely building that we have, believe or not, we spend a great deal of time talking about mobility of collections, physical and digital, regionally within the UK and across the world, and I think that's very pertinent area to discuss as well. So anyway, I'll open it to the question to all. Ola.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, I love the graphics as well. I mean, I think it's actually an ethical question I'm asking, in the sense that, so as I understand it, through the HSRC South Africa, you've been involved in the project, and now some of the material are in Cape Town?
No, there's no material in Cape Town.
Okay.
There's absolutely nothing. No, we have a couple of digital images.
Okay.
I mean, we have...
So it's the digital images that you are...
Yeah, from one from one private collection, when we mediated funding for digitization with the Mellon Foundation. We said in return we'll get 4 research purposes on the website, and researchers can tell us why they want to use it, or give us if they're at a university. Then we also, I forgot to mention that when the building was in progress, through the department or the Ministry of Arts and Culture, we could request for research purposes certain X number of manuscripts, which we did not always receive.
Okay.
let me say it hasn't always been a case of us being able to access. I mean, I should stress that. People just don't send the stuff. You just don't get the stuff.
I guess the point I was making was, but still, effectively, the copyright remains in trust with the archives in Timbuktu.
No, we can't publish a single thing. We were able to publish in that volume single pages, only with agreement from the. In fact, it's become totally the balance of forces, as it were, is totally on their end, to the extent that. It's frustrating, and they've learned how to
exercise their power.
Yeah, exercise their power. Totally. Unlike previously, they know what.
Right, that was the question.
It's interesting to see what's going to happen now, because the Germans have put in a huge lot of money into conservation efforts in Bamako. If you go to the website of the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures, an absolutely fantastic center in Hamburg, they have a whole page devoted to the recent comings and goings and the fundings, 1 million at least at one meeting I was, euros that is. So the center, I don't know if anybody knows that center, but it's a fantastic world comparative manuscript studies center. Only the Germans can still afford such things.
I mean, I guess the additional question, and I'm sorry for taking people's time, is that, it's the Sahel, that region, are you actually sharing with any of the other universities around that area? Because I think it's great that it's a South-South cooperation, that's excellent, but I sort of think about, indeed, my old history, the whole of the Hausa kingdoms, presumably. Exactly. So, I mean, do the other universities in Senegal, Nigeria, wherever else, do they have... do you have relationships with them?
Yeah, we have... I sort of informally call it calligraphic Africa. And so where we have access and where we have... Look, so many of these things are based on working relations and collegiality and so on. And so we have very good working relations with some northern Nigerian universities. And they had a long-standing northern research scheme or something that was started by English professor Abdullahi Smith in the late 50s and 60s. We work with them. We work very closely with Mauritanian scholars in Niger. But we really, there's a capacity question. Sitting in South Africa, it's very difficult because you have to have some working knowledge of French and Arabic for some of this. And I'm afraid of funding, actually, because funding can corrupt you totally. We see what's happening in where people start inflating numbers, and it's just sometimes, less is more, actually, to get things done. So I've had northern Nigerian students, fantastic PhD students from there, and good relations even with the people in Lagos and Yoruba speaking, which has a long tradition of writing in Arabic. So yeah, no, the Sahel, and it's good I got a promise by Dr. Sati that I'm welcoming the archives in Sudan. I did it deliberately because I've had problems accessing Khartoum. But I know we'll keep that on the record. We'll archive that one.
That's fine. Next question, Francis, and I think there's one at the front. Are you? No.
I just wonder, I was an administrator here 15 years ago, but Endangered Archives and the Mellon Foundation, where does that stand now?
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan of the endangered. I've been a referee for some of their applications, and I've encouraged people to apply. So, I mean, that has really opened up. So that we have these collections, I showed you images from Lamu. I showed you so I've worked with Endangered Archives on that collection. There are libraries and collections all over the place. And I think this has been a fantastic initiative by British Library.
It's still going on?
Yes, it is, yes.
It's run year from year, isn't it?
Yes. It's still going on, and there's always challenge of renewing funding and keeping going, but it is going. So.
But you see, once one family and one small collection, people start seeing that there are possibilities, then you go to another village and they'll say, this is what happened in Timbuktu. Initially it wasn't 24 libraries at all. It was just the state one with 2 or 3, and then it's just, there was no value attached to these things. You saw some of those images. They were just locked away, hoarded and forgotten, and now it's jumping up.
Fantastic. Francis and then Shinqit at the back.
Hi. I heard what you said about the effect of centralizing the manuscripts and then some of the effects of digitization process. And I wondered, you're obviously very alive to the question, and whether you thought that digitization per se risked altering these traditions, or whether it's just a poorly applied digitization which has that risk.
No, look, given what's happening in the world today, what's happening now, I mean, can you imagine what's being lost in Libya, or what's happening in Syria? I mean, I've worked in the Maktab al-Assad, and I say, as a precaution, we're going to always lose something from tradition. As a precaution, digitize, but save copies off-site. Because if you digitize and keep everything on-site, it can get lost. So I think, especially with these materials and the precarious conditions in the region, I would say digitize with as much contextual data, apart from metadata, because that itself is ethnographically important. Who does it, when it was done, how it was done, and all this. This is all part of the story. I'm now for digitization. When Timbuktu was the safest place on earth, circa 2010, we still had the luxury of arguing about things. After what happened, even though so few items actually disappeared, and apparently it disappeared to Mauritania, I'm saying rather that we have something to tell the story, to write the history, because in effect we haven't written a percentage of that history, of the collectors of those manuscripts, of all the copyists. There are theses for dozens of students to work on these things. I mean, we are ecstatic when we receive a catalogue. Relative to other spaces of scholarship in the world, a catalogue is just taken for granted, isn't it? Yeah. You just, there's a catalogue. I mean, when this Mauritanian catalogue came out now, my God, you should see my review of it. It's like, phew, because, and then it's not even the question of where are they? Can I actually access them? It's just the idea of a listing with good data on it. But the next question is, can I go to Butilimit and Shinqit and actually access these things? I mean, I don't even think of it. We have a catalogue. so go for digitization, given the state of the world.
Thank you. I certainly agree with the value of catalogues. I think Shinqit had a question in the back.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, we've, of course, come across this matter of the ethics of conservation and the physical location of the conserved material, both physically and digitizing. And I just wanted to say that the whole issue is really pretty complicated. I mean, it's not as simple as the sort of the Elgin Marbles paradigm. People from outside come and divest of your country of its treasures. That can happen, of course, and it can happen in different ways even today, and it is happening. True enough. It is also, however, the case that much material can be physically endangered, not only in obvious war zones or likely war zones, but even sort of in perfectly peaceful countries like my own. See, where there's little chance of an archive or library being sort of bombed or attacked or something. But the local custodians are, I'm sure you face this problem, they are singularly resistant to the idea of letting anybody in, even to look at the material, let alone to offer assistance with conserving them. It's not a question of money. You're talking about places where the value of archives is inflated by the lure of money. There are also a large number of places people say, we don't want your money. We're not interested in money. We just want to, keep our stuff to ourselves, where it can slowly just crumble away.
Yeah, no.
And also with digitization, also there's great resistance sometimes, because it can be regarded as a form of theft, of loaning.
Yeah.
So the issues are very complicated. I mean, obviously, the less material you move away from the site, the better. But one that has sort of persuade those custodians and try to create a general atmosphere where and it is possible to do so and also to digitize it. But that's the real challenge. The technological problems of digitization are not a challenge. The challenge is creating this kind of milieu, I think. Sorry, I've talked.
Yeah, no. I agree fully. I mean, they exist all over the place, and I mean, India is the one place, and I've visited a number of times, and I mean, we should keep talking, because I'm thinking of parallels all the time, because you have a long textual tradition in India. Yeah, and it's not always. It's also in the provinces, in the outlying regions, and so on, where you have these. So the Sahelian conditions could be compared with some of those spaces in India, where you do have your sort of your scholars and your outside the big centres that are, and there must be collections and so on.
Well, we exhausted the question, or the caffeine urge has gone too high. So we'll break, I think, for tea and coffee, but let's then.